Welcome again, everyone, both in the room and online. I'm Heidi, and I'll be the moderator for this session. And this is the Public Policy and Passive House session, a warming relationship. And I would, well, we have a minute, have anyone who wants to fill in on this side. I think you'll have a better view. I feel like we have empty seats over here and more full over there. Well, I'll introduce our panelists so you guys might think about moving. So our panelists are from the far side of me to closer is Adam Berry, who's the Senior Program Manager at the Colorado Energy Office. Paul Ormond, who's an engineer at the Department of Energy Resources in Massachusetts, and he's also a course developer and instructor for the decarbonization of the building sector course at Harvard's Extension School. And then we have Sam Lichten, who is a building electrification program administrator for the City and County of Denver's Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency. And then next we have Chris Hornstein, is the Director of Public Works for the City of Pittsburgh, where he's responsible for the maintenance and construction of all city-owned buildings. And then last but not least, on my right is Jonathan Hines, who's the Managing Director of Archetype, one of the UK's leading passive house architectural practices, and he's also on the board of the UK Passive House Trust. So today, I think we want to talk about policy, all things policy. And I'll be curious, I won't ask an audience for a live Q&A, but I think the interesting intersection here is we have people who have been through various parts of the policy journey. We're going to see some whose geographies are much further along that journey than others, kind of see how those steps move from 0 to 100. Mm-hmm. And I hopefully can also help them translate that for people in the audience who, more likely or not, you are advocates of passive house, but might not be sure how can you engage. Because at the end of the day, a collaborative effort is what's needed. It can't just be policy wonks. We want to hear from the architects. We want to hear from builders. Policymakers need to hear from all those that you can show that there's a groundswell support for this. But with that, I'm gonna go and have just run down the panel here. And I'd like, in a couple minutes or less, just say where your area is at. Where are you at on the policy journey? Getting closer to full adoption or in the earlier stages. So I'll just start and run down again. So Adam, if you'd like to start.
So I think one thing that's really important to understand about Colorado is, a lot of states talk about home rule, and I always like to say we are really home rule, where our local governments, for the most part, have had exclusive control over adoption of building policies at the local level for most of Colorado's history until relatively recently. So in the last few years, the state has definitely started taking a much more active role in setting kind of those backstop requirements. So in 2019, the state legislature passed legislation to mandate that local governments, when they adopt a building code, they must adopt one of the 3 most recent model energy codes. And just as in July of this past year, that minimum threshold stepped up to the most recent model energy code, along with electric ready, solar ready, and electric vehicle ready requirements. So I think it's important to note, though, this is not necessarily a statewide code. This is still very dependent on jurisdictions adopting these codes at the local level. And so we're very much in a place right now from a state perspective of level setting. We have jurisdictions that are all over the spectrum, from communities that have no building codes, not just no energy codes, but no building codes of any kind, all the way up to cities like Denver that have consistently adopted the most recent codes and consistently gone above the most recent codes through amendments and adoption of appendices and other requirements. And everything in between. So we are really in a place right now where we are trying to concurrently level set, bring up our communities that are, have no codes or have really outdated codes up to, a relatively recent standard. At the same time that we are trying to work with our, early adopting communities and, building partners to drive towards those, beyond code minimum stretch code requirements like passive, like readiness, like electrification. So it's definitely, we're very much a work in progress. We're very much relatively early in our journey from a statewide perspective, and you'll hear from Sam, who talks way more about Denver's perspective, and one who has been on a much longer journey and has been pursuing this for a much longer period of time. But right now in Colorado, we are, from a state perspective, our work is primarily driving through incentives and partnerships to work with local communities to build up capacity. I was just talking with Paul. It's like one of our biggest gaps is workforce too. And there are a lot of areas in the state that do not have workforce that is trained and capable of meeting, the design, construction, and back end verification and compliance of modern codes. And so we are really trying to build that up across the state through a number of incentives, through partnerships, through training and technical assistance, and with that backstop regulatory authority. I guess I shouldn't call it regulatory authority, but legal statutory authority for the minimum requirements, kind of helping us with those incentives, kind of push for that, leveling off across the state. And then, as I said, simultaneously working with our jurisdictions to try to figure out what the next steps are and how the state can be supporting, broader uptake of, beyond code minimum requirements.
Yeah, we're very lucky in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We have a long history of many decades of being pretty progressive in all codes, including energy codes. And we have a very ambitious design community of architects and engineering firms that are supportive of more and more efficiency in our code. Going back about, I'm going to get the dates wrong, around 2008, we had a greenhouse gas reduction mandate from our state legislature, and that gave our state energy office the authorization to bring on more and more enhancements in our energy code. That began establishment of a stretch code, which was a two-tiered code approach, so we could put more ambitious stuff into the upper tier. And we had many local advocates in their individual communities that adopted that higher tier right away. So that was a big boost there. And then we got a further boost in recent years from our state legislature to be even more ambitious. And we created a third tier, which now has electrification readiness, and also mandatory passive house for all multifamily over 12,000 square feet. So very privileged really to be working in a state that has that kind of momentum and wind at our back.
So Samantha Licton again from City and County of Denver. Our local government has pretty aggressive climate goals, especially in the building sector. The building sector represents just about 2/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions within city limits. And so we have a goal for all new construction to be net zero energy by 2030, and for all existing buildings to perform at net zero energy by 2040. And so in terms of the energy efficiency trajectory of our city codes, we're on track with the progress that we've been making with upcoming code cycles. And we've been focused a lot on identifying electrification as well as efficiency. And so starting January 1 of this year for new commercial construction, almost all projects are going to be required to have electric, space, and water heating. And we're going to be having similar requirements looking at retrofit at end of life for existing buildings starting 2025. On the passive house specific front, though, we're certainly behind Massachusetts. We have a couple of options within the Denver Green Code. And so anybody who's building to Denver Code has to select a couple of options from the Green Code. And so passive house is one of those options that folks can select for compliance with the electrification requirements starting January 1. Passive house buildings are going to have an exception, or buildings that meet passive levels of energy performance will still be allowed to use electric resistance if that's desired by the design team, whereas other buildings are going to be required really for heat pump technology. Where we've struggled, though, is the connection of having these within, having incentives, trying to encourage passive house, and the actual performance within our community. To date, we haven't actually seen any building projects or developers try to take advantage of that passive house provision within our green code. I could say a similar thing statewide. CHAFA, our Colorado Housing Finance Authority, has included passive house within our QAP since 2019 or 2020. It's one of the guiding principles, and there's language in there that if you meet passive house requirements, you're going to have significantly more, consideration in the determination of who is awarded tax credits. To date, Chaffa also hasn't had any developers or applications specifically using Passive House as one of those alternate the options for compliance or part of their applications. And so I think we're, as kind of the governing community, really trying to meet that ambition and figure out how we bring higher energy efficiency requirements and how we encourage this and incentivize it within our community. It becomes challenging when the community of practice isn't as developed as, say, it is in the Boston and Massachusetts area and New York City. So I think that's a space where we're looking to learn from other jurisdictions, as well as folks at this conference today, is to better understand how can we support and foster more Passive House practitioners within our local community.
Okay, thanks everybody for having me. Chris Hornstein from the city of Pittsburgh. As the director of public works, I can say that we are very early in our journey of Passive House. We've adopted the climate goals about 5 years ago. I was the practitioner that adopted Passive House as our municipal standard for large-scale vertical construction, both new and retrofit. On the building code side, our journey is very at the infancy stage. I can say on the building code perspective, we still take our lead from the state. So we know we have some coordination there to do, and we certainly advocate for all measures related to Passive House. That's like as a basis of energy efficiency improvement. Where we're hopeful is our best gains are demonstration projects, as well as sharing that knowledge locally, including discussions on making provisions in our zoning code for the inclusion of Passive House principles that will allow for at least consideration in both large-scale development as well as small-scale development. So we're hopeful there, but really we're looking to learn and grow and take some great advice from other folks who've begun this journey and see where we go from there.
Hi, so obviously bring a different perspective from a different country and different codes and different ways of doing things. But I think there's some interesting parallels. We're all striving to achieve the same ultimate aims and targets. So I think two things that have been interesting in Scotland. One has been government using its mechanism of funding new schools to set very ambitious targets for measured energy, measured kilowatt hour per square meter per year, linking that to funding over 25 years. So when I first started talking to them about Passive House and they heard about what Passive House could do and didn't really believe it, we took them to visit some that we'd already built, and they, within 20 minutes walking around to Passive House School, they were completely bowled over by how it worked, but weren't prepared to say all schools should be Passive House. So instead set a metric which could be met by Passive House. And so overnight, all the schools being done in Scotland now are meeting that metric, and most are doing it by Passive House. So there's a direct financial funding incentive to achieve a step change in delivery of schools to a very rigorous energy metric. So nothing to do with code, but a very clever mechanism to sort of force a change in the market, which we saw then the market reacting to. So contractors who had 5 years ago said, it's impossible to do Passive House in Scotland, we haven't got a supply chain, it won't be done, can't be done, jumping over each other to be the first contractor to deliver the first Passive House schools, training up their supply chain, actually collaborating together to improve the skills across the workforce, because they're all using the same subcontractors anyway. So from total cynicism to total buy-in and seeing it as the future, it's remarkable how that can happen just with one simple mechanism. And then in terms of the putting Passive House actually into building code, the impetus from that came from this really radical citizens' assembly that was set up by Scottish government, where 100 citizens were selected off the electoral register to represent the whole of Scotland geographically and socially, and then took a year and a half sort of process of hearing experts, interrogating them, discussing, and coming up with proposals for how Scotland could meet its climate ambitious targets with justice and fairness and it was really interesting to see it taken outside the normal professional world of politicians and consultants. Because when I was, for example, presenting a sort of expert witness session on Passive House and was being interrogated by citizens, it was so refreshing that they were asking questions. None of the sort of professional baggage, cynicism, can't be done, can't whatever. It was just like questioning how it could be done with a fresh perspective, which was really, really refreshing and very encouraging. And when they then went on to propose to Scottish Government that Passive House should be integrated into building code, 97 out of 100 supported that, which is remarkable. And then when the proposal to put it into legislation went to public consultation, it got 90% support. So coming from the bottom up, really pushing politicians to then adopt the code. And now when we're out to consultation across the wide industry, and we're getting all the usual cynicism from the building developers, housing developers who see it as extra cost and hassle, and you understand they're coming from a particular model where this challenges them. We can refer back to the fact that it was supported by 97% of the Citizens' Assembly and 90% of the public consultation. So this is going to happen. It's not if it's going to happen, it's how we make it happen. So yeah, interesting just to see that sort of bottom-up pushing of ideas to meet the targets which politicians have set and had no idea how they were going to meet them, meeting in the middle in a way forward.
I'd like to at least point out, if you're listening to all the different stakeholders here, so as you're thinking in your states where you might want to engage, I think certain people go straight to legislators, certain people are only thinking about the codes, but we've heard code bodies, we've heard legislators, we've heard the departments of energy. I think you have to kind of attack this with a strategy that could go out across all those pieces in your state. It's not just one of them. It's interesting, at least in a few cases, that policy for environmental goals kind of kicked it off and gave that leverage for people to say, okay, if you want to meet those goals, here's how you can do it. So again, as you're thinking through your home states, I think that's a nice way to realize you've got a lot of stakeholders. I mean, are there any key stakeholders you guys would really call out to say that are often missed? Or that is anyone here or online is thinking about what they should be thinking about as far as their stakeholders? Or maybe a better question is, as people come to you, what is helpful for you to hear? It's obviously we're a passionate group of Passive House people here. A lot of people in these spaces might not, I work with legislators in my role. More often than not, they've never heard of Passive House. So what's the information? Who would you like to hear from more? How can you guys get the information and hear from people so that you have the backing to say, yes, this makes sense to do in my area?
I mean, I personally think it's because we're all involved in the world of Passive House, it's very easy when we're talking to each other because we're all convinced. But when you're actually talking to housing developers and contractors who haven't interacted with this world, it's easy to be dismissive of them, but it's much more important to listen and understand what it is that they're worried about, and therefore what incentives or support can we give to overcome those things. So I think in terms of wider stakeholders, it's fascinating at the moment in Scotland to be part of this consultation across the industry, to actually hear where the concerns and worries are, and then think about how they can be overcome rather than just dismissing them out of hand. Because they're all people trying to do a good job. They've just got a different agenda coming from their commercial reality or whatever they're doing. So we can't be dismissive of that. We need to understand what it is. And it's really interesting to hear, say in Massachusetts, you created financial incentives to actually encourage people. And then as soon as they were there, they were jumping over each other to get that. It changes the whole psyche straight away as soon as you can find ways of not just the stick, but the carrot, I think.
I mean, I think something huge is being able to hear from local practitioners. It's one thing to be able to say, look at similar climate zones to what we have. Look at what's going on in Pennsylvania. Look at what's going on in Boston. It's one thing to say, look at what they're doing and how it's functioning. It's another to have local practitioners in your corner showing up at city council meetings, showing up and being serving on basically like technical expert committees that are supporting the code development process. It's really important to have folks who can show to their peers that this works where we live and folks are doing it as a course of practice. You see the differences similarly when you talk about like electrification or HVAC equipment. There's a huge difference between what goes on in Salt Lake City versus what goes on in Denver in terms of the adoption of VRF systems, because it's become a culture of practice within developers, which, you know, everybody belongs to their, you know, the local home builders association, or they're belonging to their local chapter of ULI. It's really important to be engaged in your own community. And I think second point to your earlier question about stakeholders, we need to be thinking about a core entity in all of this is your utility, right? At the core of Passive House, we're talking about energy usage. And so some of the folks who have the greatest things to benefit, though in some circumstances to lose, is your electric, your gas utility. In Colorado, there are 3 different kinds of electric utilities. If you're a rural cooperative, a lot of times energy efficiency isn't in their blood because they've got a lot of fixed costs for their infrastructure over the amount of customers that they have. And so trying to reduce the amount of kilowatt hours that people are using really hasn't historically been part of the model. Whereas for a municipal utility, like in Fort Collins, I know Brad Smith was here earlier today. I don't know if he's still sticking around. But they're a municipal electric utility. And so they have a lot of information about energy usage and direct connection to folks who are working on code and zoning. They're part of the same team, they report to the same city council, and so you can work really closely together between your energy and your buildings department. For the vast majority of us, though, we have investor-owned utilities like Xcel, who's the largest utility in Colorado. They're Denver's electricity and natural gas provider. They're also a sponsor of today's conference. Investor-owned utilities are generally required to have energy efficiency programs with certain budgets. Director Wiltor talked earlier today about how Xcel has requirements to reduce emissions from its gas business. They also have requirements to reduce emissions from their electric business. They're also required to do electrification programs. And so the efficiency of buildings and new construction can be a huge part in the savings that they can achieve. It's also huge for your electric infrastructure. We have capacity constraints in downtown Denver in terms of our electric grid. And we've had, you know, affordable housing developments want to go all electric, and then they see that they're stuck with a $3 million bill and maybe a 5-year timeline to have the available electric capacity at their site to do the project that they're trying to do. That isn't necessarily because they're all electric, right? Like if you're a dual fuel building, you're also going to increase that capacity requirement. But if we can think about how efficiency from the envelope first creates not just benefits for that specific project, but the whole energy system that you're connected to.
Yeah,
I was just gonna add, Paul, you should talk about utilities.
Yeah, I'd like to just add to this discussion about the utilities. One thing that's become clear to me is that we, state energy people, you know, passive house nerds, building scientists, we need to do a lot more to convey to the utility planners that when you build a passive house, or when you include in your code things like low air infiltration, better envelope, dealing with thermal bridges, high levels of ventilation under recovery, that combination of 4 things, you crush heating loads to oblivion in most commercial buildings. I've trademarked that phrase, and every time you say that, you have to pay me $10. $10 is what you owe me every time you use that phrase. And this has not gotten out there to the utilities in my experience. And it makes sense. Utilities are really, 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 really big organizations. There's a lot of people. So this is going to be a long-term project. But we do need to get that message out there about what Passive House can deliver in this space in terms of reducing space heating, because otherwise what's happening is the utilities are on autopilot and they're assuming that everything else is the same, except they're swapping gas space heating to electric space heating, and all that's going to happen is your electric peaks are going to go up. And they're planning their grid accordingly. And we need to have an intervention to explain, and again, this is on us we need to really convey out there that that baseline that you've been working with is no longer true. And that when we reduce space heating demands like we can with Passive House, when you make that switch from gas to electric space heating, it doesn't increase the peak electric use like you think it does. It may in fact reduce it. In fact, so we did a very big study on this for lots of building types, climate zone 5, I can share it with you. It makes better utilization of the electric grid to go from gas space heating with the old code to electric space heating with a Passive House code. You're making better utilization of your electric grid in both summer and winter. You're using the same infrastructure on a more steady basis through the year. So that's a message that we need to really get out there into the world. I feel like the next Passive House Network conference should be about just that one thing.
Thank you. I'm going to switch the conversation a little bit to codes because I feel like that's always on people's minds, but I don't feel like people always know that process either. Adam, I'll look to you to at least talk a little bit about Colorado's, and if other people want to chime in from perspectives from their areas. I mean, often I think the things that you have to look forward into your state is get to know who's on your energy code boards, get to know who's on your technical advisory groups. If you have them in your state, those are the ones that lead into those boards and give recommendations. We're going through that process right now in Minnesota, and it's a long journey. And there's ways where, and there's people in this room, I believe, who've helped on some of the code proposals to those tags in Minnesota. So that's everyday people, that's architects who are helping on those. So those are things you can be working on in your states as well. But I'll stop and I'll let Adam maybe chime in a little bit what people can look forward to and where maybe they can have places of inflection in the code process.
Yeah, so Colorado is, again, pretty new at developing codes from the state level. So we have the Colorado Energy Code Board, which was created, I guess, about a year and a half ago by state legislation. And this board is essentially a conglomeration of a number of different stakeholders, from local building officials to MEP professionals to engineers to architects, all across the different stakeholders that are involved in this. And we have recently gone through an energy code development cycle really that was focused specifically on readiness stretch provisions, and that is now what's in effect as kind of our backstop energy code requirement. But that was not it was not a one and done type of situation, and so this energy code board is going to be reconvening in the coming months to develop what the legislation dubbed the low energy and carbon code. And I think that is really the state's opportunity to push for significant improvements to building thermal envelope requirements, to requirements for electrification pathways. And so this energy code board is really going to be looking to the public, looking to advocates, I think, to really understand what are the opportunities and how can we work within the structure we have and within the legislative directives that we have. I mean, I think that that's true, and every state is going to face different challenges because every state is operating under different legislative authority, different structures, and so in Colorado we are somewhat limited by the parameters that this legislation has put on what can be included in this code. It really is focused a lot on the base model IECC, latest model IECC, and the appendices within the IECC. And so, part of what, the expertise that we're looking for and the input that we're looking for is how can we utilize those appendices and potentially modify them or combine them to create these types of policies that can push for passive house, because there isn't necessarily a straight up passive house appendix to the IECC. But are there ways that you can modify an IECC appendix that could give us something like a passive house pathway? So I think that where we're really looking for input is a lot on the technical side, is how can we use this, and then input from stakeholders on how these different policies are going to be impactful across the state. We also have the most diverse climate of any state in the United States. We go from climate zone 4B all the way up to climate zone 7. So one size fits all is not necessarily an approach that's going to work in Colorado either. What works in 4B is not going to work in 7 in a lot of cases. And even if it does, a lot of the perception from people in climate zone 7 is that what is working in 4B is not going to work for them. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it won't work. It means that they don't think it will. And so we have to be really creative in providing pathways that provide flexibility, provide, different pathways that can be effective in different climate zones. And all of that requires stakeholder input. It requires technical input. And so, I think that this energy code process is really our bread and butter opportunity for, advocates and those technical experts to really help us out and figure out how we can make that as effective as possible.
I can talk a little bit to it. So in communities like Denver, you actually have a lot of authority that comes from our elected officials. We have a building performance standard because it was passed by our city council. We have electrification requirements because they were okayed by city council. We do have a lot of citizen input. We have a vast history of working with people across the community for our Energize Denver task force, for figuring out what our codes will look like. We have technical advisory committees. But in some cases, it is elected officials who have very likely little understanding at all of what building codes look like, how they function, among all the other things that they are responsible for. And so one thing that I think is important to remember is that everyone is a constituent. There is someone at your elected body who is there to represent you, and you should not be afraid to ask them out to coffee or say, hey, this is something I'm really interested in. I have a proposal. In a lot of places like Colorado, your elected officials are really shortly staffed. I think state legislators still only get one aide, and that is their assistance that they have for 5 months of the year. Otherwise, they're kind of on their own. City council in Denver is a little bit better staffed, and it pays better too. But
Denver has a lot of benefits for their staff that the state does not have.
But these are folks who are elected to represent you, and I think that's an important engagement opportunity because they're looking for experts. They want someone who can tell them, no, this is actually what's going on instead of just hearsay. And so in terms of codes, in addition to thinking about more formal regulatory bodies like code commissions, where they are explicitly usually designed to have, a representative from workforce, a representative who has architectural experience, a representative who comes from the energy industry, a representative from disproportionately impacted communities, instead of something which is really like a curated community that you'll find on more formalized building codes and code boards. You also are going to have to deal with a little bit of the wild, wild west. That's like ultimate authority within, your governance, which can be city council or a state legislature.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you, guys. I'm going to shift now the conversation towards workforce. And Chris, I'm assuming you're a little bit more on the ground and seeing what has to happen to actually get these buildings built and renovated, and you're looking for builders. You're probably having to put out RFPs, things like that. I think a big question, start with what's just been your experience, and I'd like to broaden it to the group as to what do we need to do to build up the workforce, both tradespeople and certifying designers and architects. I mean, there's still room to grow there, and I'll just put in a plug. I know EMU's here. If you guys talk to them, they are a tradesperson certifier. Actually, just did their training a couple weeks ago. Here's hoping I pass the exam. But I've learned firsthand now that air sealing and insulating is not, it's not how it's commonly done by most tradespeople, and it's a learning curve. So, but before I go on again.
Yeah, absolutely. The first step is assembling a great team. I mean, I think you really, at the beginning, you really need to seek out passive house experts. I mean, that's where we became very fortunate in the city of Pittsburgh. We had some that were practicing in our area. We built relationships with them. We found ways to partner with them. That is the key critical first part, and making sure they're critically involved throughout the whole life cycle, design and construction life cycle. I think Jonathan's examples from his youth when he was talking at the keynote speak is actually really poignant, where he was like, oh, we were like local builder owner. I can't just give them a set of drawings and expect them to put it together. So that's where we found success. We've certainly, within our code provisions, we've discussed with our licensing agencies, like, hey, can we recognize this? Can we find ways to encourage the development of this trade and skill in our regional workforce, just so they're able to receive others doing it, which I think is really, really important, because the tradespeople have a portion of that too. I think that the thing we often overlook about our own tradespeople is if they are engaged in the outcome. I know this because I have tradespeople that work for me. If they are engaged as part of the design process, they're very crafty. It is literally their job to be problem solve every day in their jobs, and they will help you identify solutions that, and see problems that you didn't see, but also solutions to those problems. So we really try to encourage and foster that partnership. We like to see, it's a challenge for us to do actual design build itself, but we try to formulate our teams and our contracting process to really emphasize that partnership is absolutely critical for success.
I think we also want to acknowledge that the construction industry is really struggling right now. Whether you're talking about HVAC, whether you're talking about carpentry, whether you're talking about insulation, everyone is short on hands when it comes to folks working in the skilled trades. And so some of this is also driving up cost, which makes everything harder because of the scarcity, and folks can be pickier with their projects. And so there's both work that needs to happen. There's upskilling the existing workforce, so that way they are more informed about, whether it's something like passive house or just more modern building techniques, whether it's more modern equipment, the fact that heat pumps have changed enormously over the past 20 years. It's also trying to get people to think differently about their business. For the vast majority of the residential work that happens in a place like Denver, you're not going to have a passive house consultant helping your homeowner with their project. The best that you can really hope for is get the HVAC contractors to start partnering with insulators in ways that they really haven't done before. In Colorado, we've got something called the MEP Alliance. So a lot of our mechanical, electrical, and plumbing trades, they're really well socialized, whether that's Local 208, our pipe fitters union, the plumbers union, the Rocky Mountain Mechanical Contractors Association, the local SMACNA chapter. They're really in communications and trying to keep connected. But that's all of the MEP work. When we're talking about passive house, and we're talking about high performance building, we need to have folks who are working on the shell, hopefully working first before we start updating on any of your mechanical systems. And so I think there's cultivation and relationships that need to happen within your community. And this is something which our office is trying to work on. We've got a mini grant program right now where we're offering up to $50,000 for folks doing trainings and trying to build workforce specifically within the building decarbonization space. We're going to have an RFP going out soon as well, trying to award, 7 figures to folks looking at workforce development in this space. But there's both upskilling your existing workforce as well as figuring out how can you improve the pipeline. How do we start getting more young people to see the building trades and this construction work as a viable career? And you know what folks like the chapter director for our local chapter for the Association of General Contractors say? Young people should be really excited to get into building work because it's environmental work, because it's community work. If you care about the environment, if you care about what's going on in your community, there's few industries that are better positioned than if you're working in the building sector.
I was going to add too, I think that one thing we really need to talk about when we're talking about workforce, particularly in a state like Colorado, where it's such a large, geographically large state, is where is that workforce? So, and especially on the compliance, verification, and enforcement side of codes, not just from a passive house perspective, but just even from base model codes, is we have many areas of the state where the closest person who can do blower door or air leakage and duct leakage testing is 250 miles away. And it costs thousands of dollars to bring, a rater, HERS rater or a tester or, somebody out to those locations to do that verification. And so those jurisdictions are saying, essentially throwing their hands up and saying, well, why would we adopt codes that require these types of, ratings and testing when we don't have anyone who's able to do that? And so that's another thing that we've been really focused on in trying to build out our regional workforce opportunities, is building up capacity, not necessarily in every community, but at least on a regional level, so that we have, we have more incentive and less resistance to adopting codes that have those requirements, because we actually will have people in those areas who can do the verification.
I think one of the things I find really interesting about delivering Passive House on site is that the focus on certification and the quality checking changes the culture completely, because everybody has to be bought in to knowing that their bit of work is contributing to the greater good of the certification at the end. And if they get it wrong, they let the whole team down. And it sort of changes the culture from the usual building culture, which is do your job, quick, fast, get out and go away, to something where you know that you can't do that anymore because you'll be called back to sort it out. And one really nice example of that recently on one of our school projects in Edinburgh is that the groundwork subcontractor who was laying out the under concrete slab insulation and had to get, I think, maximum 3mm gap between boards, became obsessed with getting this right. Normally, they would have not even thought about it. They would have thrown them out, poured the concrete on top, job done. To the extent that he sent the entire delivery of insulation boards back to the supplier saying, these are not square enough for me to meet the quality I needed on site. It has to be the first time in history a groundwork subcontractor sent insulation boards back because they're not square enough. But that is how the culture changes on a Passive House site. And so, yes, we've got a problem with the skills in the industry as well, as you've talked about. But I think Passive House is changing that culture, because people, it's not that you have to be supremely, skills that are not gainable. It's about getting the right skills at the right time and motivating people to respond to that. And it's really very powerful, I think, that.
Yeah, I'd add that this is a topic where you really need to go big, and you need a lot of money. So if you're planning any sort of major decarbonization in your state, this really is like the first thing you should do, aside, in conjunction with getting better codes. Do those concurrently, because you need to really train a lot of people in a significant way, and it's going to cost tens of millions of dollars to do so, and to get it in the regions that you need it, both the trades as well as the professionals, the architects, et cetera. The tree you want to shake is the utilities. So if your utility has a electric or gas, if they're administering efficiency programs, usually those programs have already included for decades energy efficiency training of some sort. So work your way into those programs, shake the utility tree for funding, and get the trades and the professionals trained up in this and go big. Have a full-time staff to just do this. And also, in Massachusetts, one thing that we kind of got lucky on is that we have Passive House Massachusetts. It's an advocacy organization for just bringing Passive House issues within Massachusetts. And they were very, very active at making sure the training was there, and then also delivering of the training. So you can lean on those kind of advocates as well to help you.
And I just want to add one more thing. Within the professional industries, there's also a lot of inertia with architects and within engineers. And so if you have opportunities as folks who are excited enough to come out to Denver to be part of this conference, don't just spend time with your local Passive House chapter. Show up to your local AIA. Show up to local organizations and spaces where you're going to be interacting with folks who aren't going to have the same opinions about this kind of high performance building. And by being in that community, you have a greater ability to influence, bringing in more folks to the table, having more practitioners who are able to be offering these sorts of services. So don't underestimate the power that you have to help shape your own community.
Yeah, and one of the things I've always found really inspiring about the whole Passive House community is how willing people are to share experience and support each other. There's nothing else like it in the industry. People normally keep things to themselves. Passive House world, people share and they spread the word and they support each other. And people outside Passive House world always seem quite surprised when they see that happening. And I've had people say to me, well, why are you going to speak here, speak there, do this, do that? You're giving away your position in the market. I said, no, I'm not. I'm expanding the market. It's going to benefit me and you. So I think we can support each other hugely, and that's what events like this are all about. And between states, between nations, between competitors, we can all support each other to benefit each other and the journey that we're on.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I'm going to ask a couple more questions before I open it up to the audience, so you guys can start preparing that. Let's talk about retrofits. Anyone?
Well, I mean, retrofit is the biggest challenge. I mean, when we were working with the City of Edinburgh and they decided to adopt Passive House for all their schools, a year or two later they came back to me and said, we've just realised that that was the easy thing. We thought it was hard, but it was easy. We've got 400 buildings. We've got a target to be zero carbon by 2030. What the hell do we do? And I said, well, you've seen the rigour of Passive House. I think we should apply that same rigour to existing estate. And so we developed this idea called an benefit-informed retrofit plan. We basically take an existing building, we analyse it accurately with PHPP, we air test the building, analyse it, check that base model of PHPP against actual utility bills. And so we've got an accurate base. And then we can model scenarios from different levels of intervention all the way through to full benefit, cost each one, give the energy and the carbon reduction for each one, and then help the authority make a decision about, yes, that building makes sense to full benefit. Most don't because it's too expensive, but actually you can make the right decision based on accurate technical analysis. Too many people who are just retrofitting, apply a bit of insulation here, a bit of that there, without really understanding if they're doing the right thing. And I think for us, the beauty of PHPP is that accuracy and then the ability to model options very, very quickly and accurately. If we put triple glazed windows, if we improve the air tightness, if we do this, we do that. And on one building, we can see we're losing 30% of the heat through the roof. We can address that. On another building, it's only 5%, but actually the big issue on that is ventilation. I mean, we've now done this analysis for about a quarter of the local authorities in Scotland and about 30 different buildings. And it's been really interesting to see how they vary. And actually the air tightness on a Victorian stone-built school building isn't too bad. Our worst air tightness that we did was a 5-year-old low-energy school where we couldn't even get a measurement. It was so leaky. It was like, how did that happen? But we can address that building really easily because we know what the problem is. Anyway, so yeah, I would say for retrofit, start off by getting accurate analysis using PHPP so you can make the right decision now or over time or in the future based on good data, not just random assumptions.
Yeah, I think that's where we also see it as well. I think the reality is any property owner, whether they're municipal, commercial, residential, is going to be struggling for a bit financially to fund, and they'll seek out opportunities. But I think with the accurate base modeling, which can be done quickly and easily, I too am an owner of 3 million square feet and 400 buildings. Figuring out how to go and how to balance the needs of a diverse user population, firefighters, police officers, recreation centers, what have you. I mean, we have a lot of different demands that we need to do. Being able to compartmentalize that work to achieve both benefit for energy purposes as well as user purposes. The EnerFit model actually makes it a lot easier to do so because it just gives you actionable data, factual things that you can go to folks and say, this is where we think we need to make our investment. We think this is the biggest bang for your buck. And we really try to lean into not just the energy component parts of it, but we also lean into the environmental benefits of PHPP. I think Jonathan said it best in his keynote, like just looking at CO2 levels. Speaking that language to a firefighter is actually pretty impactful as a user. Speaking that language to an affordable housing advocate, equally impactful, right? So we're able to bridge across a bunch of different user groups, and it is a way in which we can deliver benefits equitably across like an entire system of people.
So retrofits keep me up at night, and I feel like we're missing something on retrofits here in the US. And there's fundamentals that we need to understand better. So, you know, when we build a new building, you capitalize all the stuff, all the envelope and things of that nature, and then you take out a mortgage, and the capitalization of all that stuff is spread out over the life of the building. So even if you if you buy the building, you capitalize it, and even if 5 years later you sell the building, you get your value back, because the capitalization of that building was part of the value of the structure. So, you know, in new construction, it's easy, quote unquote, to get some of these things done because they can be capitalized over decades. But with a retrofit, we don't have any easy way to do that capitalization, amortization over time. And that's kind of a key that's missing, that needs to unlock better, more ambitious retrofits. Now, we do have things like CPACE, and there's a lot of dead bodies lying around on that, you know, as the easy solution for this. But the underlying idea is great. What CPACE allows you to do is to capitalize energy efficiency improvements, and then you put those costs onto your tax bill. And that way the amortization then carries over even after you sold the building. And that makes sense, because you know, we don't want to knock someone over the head that just happens to be the owner when there needed to be a retrofit for all the capitalization of improvements that last for the life of the building. But there's so many difficulties with CPACE, like it doesn't have a long enough life. It needs to be 50 years, not 15. And so I think
Paul,
there's
for
just
people who don't know what CPACE is,
I'm sorry?
could you just explain real quick what CPACE is?
CPACE. CPACE
I'm one of those
is
people who doesn't know.
commercial property assessed clean energy. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah, it allows you to, you take out a loan for building improvements, and then the loan is paid back through taxes, through the local taxes on the property owner. So if you sell your building, that debt carries on to the next owner. So I just feel like we have to come up with something like that, because we need to have a way to amortize the capitalization of retrofits across the multiple building owners that will occur over the next decades of that building, like we automatically get with new construction. I don't know what the solution is yet, so to work on it, but that's my idea.
I was just going to say, I mean, we're definitely very interested in that, you know, tariff on bill financing, particularly for residential, is, you know, kind of the residential version of CPACE somewhat, with your utility, and making sure that you can pay it off. And again, similarly, I think one of the biggest challenges with all these financing mechanisms is, to your point, is that the financing mechanism and the debt needs to follow the property and not the individual or the owner. And that can be a challenge, particularly when it comes to, like, you know, any kind of personal loan or personal financing, is that the debt follows the person, not the property. And so I think, you know, tariff on bill financing, I agree with you. CPACE has had a number of challenges. It's something we are trying to expand and build back out in Colorado. This energy office also for public buildings and schools runs the energy performance contracting program, which is not dissimilar from tariff on bill financing, except for public buildings. So there are a number of mechanisms that we are working on and looking into, but I would say that there is no, you know, silver bullet solution that folks have figured out. I think successful on bill financing could potentially be the silver bullet if, you know, we can get it widespread enough.
And if you're looking for projects that might be good candidates for retrofits, if your community has a building performance standard, you should take care of the publicly available information. Denver has been benchmarking since 2016. Our first interim target for our building performance standard comes into play for the 2025 energy use year. And we have public information. You can see what the current UI is of all buildings over 25,000 square feet in the city who are part of this program. You can see what their energy use target is, where they're supposed to be in 2030 and where they're supposed to be in 2025 and 2027, and how much the city potentially could fine them for not being in compliance. That can also be a motivator. I know we don't really want to be like scaring building owners that way with like the threat of liens or enormous fines, but it's one of the mechanisms that a lot of jurisdictions are trying to figure out. How do you encourage, how do you make retrofits happen? How do we decrease the energy use in our building sector? It's really hard. And so if you're in a community where this information is publicly available, our building owners need help. My HOA needs help. And so there's also ways that you can try to find who might be really interested property owners to start looking at earlier projects, because they've got something on the line now too.
No, well, I think I'm going to wrap up my questions. And I would like to at least right now make a plug for some of the reports and research that Passive House Network has put out. We didn't get into the hairy weeds today. How do you actually have these discussions? What information? And Bronwyn is holding up some great pieces that you can actually just grab out front. We just today picked up the bookmarks that will give you a quick QR code link to all these reports. I'll just note Stepping Up to Passive Policies We Want is a good one. Safe at Home, how all electric multifamily passive house buildings deliver comfortable, cost-effective resilience. There's a number of reports on there. Look through them. Those are where you're going to find information that you should be bringing to these conversations. You know, the proof is in the pudding. Bronwyn, thank you so much for working so hard in all these years to make those happen, and many others. But with that, I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. Make sure you get a microphone, because there are people online and we want them to hear as well. Do we have someone to run microphones? Yes, we do. So Bronwyn will actually start with you.
Hi there. Thanks, Heidi, for this great panel. Thanks for plugging the swag to available for everybody, QR codes, so you don't have to print them. My question is regarding retrofits to the policy folks on the panel. What we found as practitioners in the US is we don't have access to great products. Our product market in the US is, be generous, and I'll say it's medieval. Are policymakers looking at simultaneously incentivizing manufacturers to bring better products to our market? Because in Colorado, you've got a climate zone 7. We have one quad pane window manufacturer. It is here in Colorado. Shout out to Alpin. We need ventilation systems. We need air sealing technologies. We've got at least a decent number of those. But locally manufactured windows, we've been importing them for a long time. Incentive programs for manufacturers, what's the outlook on that?
I mean, I'm going to say that's a hard investment to make at a subnational level. Like that's we're having challenges trying to think, like, do we have incentive dollars to try to increase electrification? Can we even spend that for like HVAC distributors who might serve our region, but also are those taxpayer dollars going to go and support, you know, end customers who are outside of our jurisdiction? So I think it's a hard topic to broach, especially for local governments. I mean, there are certainly efforts by states to court various manufacturers. I mean, you see this, sometimes it's a race to the bottom, trying to get folks to come to you, bring jobs to your local government, or not your local government, but your local community. It's a tricky one to ask and to bring, especially to local governments. And I think it's something where we really need leadership at higher levels.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. It was really very helpful. My question kind of is, there's 2 or 3 kind of separate ones. The first one on the building performance standard. Has there any thought been put in on how we can connect the work for the building performance standard to Passive House, so that there is more thought within the retrofit work to doing Passive House as part of meeting the building performance standard requirement? Because my sense is that what happens with building performance standards is that people will go absolutely to the lowest portion of the tree, and whatever we don't get to really maximize the savings. I'll just ask my other two really quick. Number two, something I'm very, very much been trying to say, we need as a community to both simplify and demystify passive house. One of the problems that always seems to arise is that we get very much into the weeds, and then people think, particular builders, developers and the like, that this is some really crazy, esoteric kind of construction methodology, when really it's air sealing, a caulking gun, or it's just getting the ventilation right. It's nothing that anybody doesn't do. It's more we want to try to do it better. So I really want to emphasize the simplifying and demystifying part of this as part of our discussion. And the third part is that I think another thing that we really need to think about as we're doing advocacy is that we need to think about it from a very comprehensive level, in terms of starting from, if you even talk about codes, but it goes through making sure that you have the workforce, but then you also have the ability to do the operations and the maintenance. I have heard from developers many, many times that they don't want to do passive house, or actually they don't want to do VRF, because when they do VRF, their operations and maintenance and repair costs explode. So they just don't want to do it. So we need to think about how to make sure that as we're talking about it and as we're trying to solve problems, we solve the problems comprehensively and not just one at a time.
I'd like to just speak to the building performance standard thing just a little bit, and I agree with the other 2 points you made. Ours is very well spoken. The building performance standard, one of the concerns I have with building performance standards is that it sets up things so that it's too much of a reactionary response. It's like, okay, we're allowed to be under this threshold today, and then in 5 years we have to be here, and then in 5 years we'll be there. So we're gonna do whatever just minimum thing we gotta do to get that 5-year thing. And then there isn't really a big motivation to just get to the best thing right off the bat. And to your point, that might be the best thing. That might be, the best move altogether. So I think we have a lot of work to do to utilize building performance standards to our advantage, but hopefully make the pitch good enough to people that own buildings to get to an enter-fit type retrofit, and to get to that best performance that's expected of them 30 years from now today, and it's worth their while. So we have a lot of work to do to do that, but that to me makes perfect sense, rather than this kind of reactionary thing that I think we're gonna see with many building performance standards.
I think in responding to the concern about demystifying, I completely agree with that. And that was one of the challenges that we faced in the beginning until we just kind of came to a communication protocol where simple is best. And it was really, this is an airtight bag. I'm either going to put the airtight bag in the building, or I'm going to put the building in the airtight bag. And there's just one or two approaches to it. Because I live in the O&M world, one of the reasons why I really pushed hard for the passive house approach is because ultimately we all live in this world. Buildings are practically a living organism at this point, very complex systems. It actually, with proper assemblies, reduces complexity. And what you find as a result over long-term cost of amortization is that your long-term exposure to not just O&M, because your utility bills are so much reduced. I mean, I have buildings that were retrofit that were going from probably a 400 EUI to a 27, which speaks to the condition of the building when it was tested, trust me.
Whoops.
But to the point, the selling point is it's not just about this. I also staff those HVAC techs. I staff those electricians. I understand the pressures that they are under to deliver under current infrastructure. This actually ensures their job into perpetuity, because that risk associated with a passive house approach, it's just much lower over the long term. A traditional approach is going to continue to stress the workforce, because it would continue to just replicate what has already been done, which we all here know doesn't work, or is going to lead us down a dark path. I like the one phrase, well, I believe I heard this, that I live in the energy world, so I live in darkness. I kind of like that. But so for me, and my approach to speaking with leadership this is about reducing the risk for everybody, like both short-term and long-term. And I think that's a really, really critical message to put out there, along with the humanistic life, health, safety benefits that come with it.
And I just add to that, I feel like conversations that I've heard through today and talking with policymakers is sometimes there's a debate of when is it even worth mentioning passive house? Sometimes you have to back out from there. Sometimes, to the demystifying, start talking, you might have to level set people and get them just understanding what an envelope is. I mean, that when you're working with your legislators, your state officials, you might need to start there first and work your way up to passive house. So next question.
So you asked about stakeholders that are missing, and I would say renters and home buyers. And because they're driving the market, so a developer is building houses they can sell to somebody, and an apartment owner wants to rent their apartments. And so reaching those people, I think, is very important. One way of doing it is to require that the EUI for any home be that that you have to disclose that information, and that you also disclose that information to renters. And when I look at California required restaurants to put the calorie content on everything they were selling, and once they started doing that, all of a sudden Starbucks started selling mini pastries. And so that's something people can understand. They can compare the EUI for this house versus that house. And ultimately, as their energy bills go up, and even sort of the people who want to be sustainable, they now have a really easy measure to say, this is where I want to live, and this is how I want to invest my money.
No, I think that makes sense. And to Sam's point about, hey, we want to hear from what's happening in your community, as you are getting buildings too that are built to passive house standards, something even I've done is point to people who live there, point to, especially, when we're talking EJ, environmental justice, to have people say, sometimes it's not even the conversation about their energy bill saving. It's saying my asthma has gone away. It's saying I'm more relaxed in my home because I'm not listening to the crazy traffic outside. Those sorts of things will resonate, again, with policymakers. That is definitely a story that should be brought up and shared. And those are definitely stakeholders too. So thank you for reminding us.
So first, just a quick comment and then two questions. One, the comment is, congratulations to everybody in the room that's still here. I believe personally that this is the single most important topic for this entire conference. So thank you. I think what most of us need is, what are the first steps? So during the code conversation last week in the online version, he'd mentioned that he'd been at it for years. He had been working on getting passive house on the code. And you got to start somewhere. So I want to hear what you guys all think. As far as policy goes, what is the first step? My personal thought is at least get Passive House recognized as an alternate path as to meeting the sustainability requirements for your local community, for your county, and for your state. And then finally, for Denver, Samantha, you'd mentioned that you've got some future sticks in place. They've got to meet a certain EUI or whatever it is. Those sticks are in place, but what incentives, what carrots are in place today to help get to your 2025 sticks?
Well, I can jump in just on a general approach. So first of all, definitely look at the Policy That Works research report. It outlines kind of, they did a good survey study of places that have seen adoption and saying, okay, what are the commonalities? What are policies that make sense? To the energy code piece, again, get to know who's on your energy code boards and your technical advisory groups. Get to know them now, because it's so easy to get to be too late, too fast. You gotta be in that door almost before it's started. So, and I'm happy to have this conversation. Obviously, you're getting into my space. For those of you who don't know me, I work for Owens Corning in the government affairs space. So this is I get paid to do this. But I think, and the policy side too, I think you've got to go in and just start with the officials that are for your jurisdictions, get to know where they're at, start sussing out who are the officials in your state too, who might be more on your side, and start working with them. Start thinking about what your asks might be. I mean, that's the biggest thing. You can go and tell them what Passive House is, but they need to know, okay, what do I do with this? And so start, look at the examples from what you've seen happen in other jurisdictions. Look at the research reports and say, hey, is this something we could do here? Have a few options. I think that's a really good starting point. But I'll stop there. I'm happy to talk more later.
May I answer the starting point question too? Just another shameless plug here. The starting point isn't necessarily getting Passive House in your code. That might be too big of a leap. Depends on your situation. A great starting point is Passive House by stealth methods. So what that is the starting point for the codes you want is make sure you have low air infiltration, make sure that you test for air infiltration, get that into your code. Those are now in IECC, which is great. What is not in IECC that you can get is dealing with thermal bridges, and other things that reduce space heating load. So if you can get those things in your code, those are a great first step for your state on the journey to Passive House.
On that second piece that you said about the first step, what I would say is learn the levers is really the first thing that you need to do. So when our QAP was updated in, I think, 2019, it was basically the first time in 10 years that the environmental provisions had been updated. And a huge reason why that happened is because a local builder in Fort Collins convinced her state representative to try to introduce a bill requiring it in the QAP. When Shaffa heard about that, they were like, we need a meeting about this. What are you trying to put in state legislation? And so there's different levers that you can pull. And so understanding, how is the building code, how is that process goes? Who are the decision makers? What are the different levers and the different parts of this government system that have power over the things I want to change? That's really key, is understanding where you can actually best use your effort and your time, because showing up at every public comment that your city council has might make people know who you are. But if you instead volunteer with a city council person and say, hey, I want to work with you on this bill, that's a much greater position of influence. On that third piece that you had, asking Denver about what kind of incentives we have, something to know is that Denver's climate office is actually really new. So the Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency was founded in 2020 by a ballot initiative in the city, which both created us as a full dedicated agency. Previously, there'd been a really small mayor's office of sustainability and a division kind of buried within our public health department. And so it both created a climate office and it also gave us resources that very few local governments have. We now have a sales tax provision that provides my office with roughly $40 million a year. And so we are in the process and we've been developing what kind of incentives we as a local government can provide. Right now, a lot of those are more in the electrification space than they are in the efficiency space. For example, we have $25 million we're trying to spend over the next 3 years to support commercial electrification. Not all local governments have the ability to do that. We also are trying to provide better navigational services. If you want to learn the specifics about our building performance standard, I encourage you to talk to some of my colleagues who are here, who manage our building performance program. But we're really trying to offer navigational services as well as potential adjustments. We aren't trying to change people's targets, but if you work with the city and show that you're working towards this, you might get an adjustment. Okay, we can push back the date for compliance. Okay, we have additional provisions where your target can be 10% easier to meet if your building is going to be 80% electrified by 2030. You can use renewable energy to offset some of the energy usage that's above your target. And so some of it is really trying to get building owners to recognize that we aren't just scary, faceless people. We've got compliance officers, we've got staff whose whole job is to help people get into compliance and help navigate on the way. We still have a long way to go, and we're working with other local governments trying to figure out, are there more programs we can implement to help improve efficiency in income qualified households or disproportionately impacted communities. We've got programs like our Healthy Homes program, which is really doing health and safety as well as electrification upgrades and efficiency for low-income folks in Denver and folks specifically who have respiratory illness, talking about the indoor air quality issue. So there are a lot of different ways that my office is trying to get at this issue. We haven't quite solved it all yet.
Well, I'm going to end it there. I think Sam makes a good point, though. Your officials are not scary people. They're just people. They would love to work with you for the most part. So definitely work with them, go and offer to help and walk alongside them in that journey. But with that, that is our wonderful panel to conclude today. Thank you guys so much.